The carriage wheels crunched along the winding country road, sending small clouds of dust into the cool morning air. Clara Montague, seated with her composed posture, let her eyes wander over the familiar landscape. Rolling fields stretched to the horizon, dotted with hedgerows and wildflowers, and the faint scent of damp earth clung to the breeze. It was a scent she had not breathed for many years, yet it stirred a deep, aching familiarity within her. She had left this place once, long ago, certain she would never return. London had been her refuge then, the stage upon which she had built a life of society and refinement, far from the expectations of family and farm. And now she was back, not as a daughter, nor as a girl seeking freedom, but as a woman charged with the solemn task of managing her family's lands, deciding their fate, and, perhaps unwillingly, facing the ghosts of a childhood she had tried to forget. The Montague estate appeared through the morning mist, grand, yet tinged with melancholy. Its stone walls, once proud and vibrant, bore the gentle wear of time and neglect. The windows gleamed faintly in the sunlight, revealing the ghosts of the lives that had passed within. Clara's chest tightened. Every familiar corner, every tree along the drive seemed to whisper memories she had long attempted to bury. She guided the carriage to a halt before the grand entrance. The iron gates, engraved with the Montague crest, opened with a reluctant creak, and the sight of the mansion's sprawling gardens brought back the summers of her youth, the laughter, the long walks with her siblings, the quiet hours spent reading beneath the shade of ancient oaks. A pang of longing and regret passed through her, quickly replaced by the resolve that had carried her across the countryside. Stepping down, Clara brushed a gloved hand along the edge of the carriage. She inhaled deeply, filling her lungs with the familiar scent of grass and earth. This land, these fields, and this house had once been her world, and now, though she had believed she would never return, she knew that she could not leave without confronting all that had been left behind. As the carriage rolled away, the echo of its wheels fading, Clara remained on the threshold of the estate. A long journey had brought her here, but it was only the beginning. Somewhere, beyond the hedgerows and along the neighboring fields, shadows of the past awaited, shadows she had left behind, yet could never escape entirely. Her heart stirred as she realized that returning to the Montague estate was not merely a matter of duty. It was the first step in confronting everything she had abandoned, the land, the legacy, and, most unexpectedly, a certain figure from her past whose presence could unravel both her composure and her carefully constructed plans. Clara walked along the garden path, her boots sinking slightly into the damp earth. The morning sun struggled to pierce the low-hanging mist, casting everything in a soft, silvery haze. She moved with careful deliberation, taking in the familiar shapes of hedges, fountains, and the ancient oak at the far end of the lawn. Memories tugged at her chest. Lazy afternoons spent reading beneath that very tree, her small hand entwined with another, a boy with bright eyes and a mischievous grin. And there he was. From across the neighboring field a figure emerged, riding slowly atop a chestnut mare. His presence was unmistakable even after the many years. Tall, broad-shouldered, and impeccably poised, the man carried himself with a confidence Clara had once admired and feared. His dark coat gleamed faintly with the morning dew, and his hat was tipped at a careful angle, as if concealing both thought and emotion. "Henry Calder," she breathed almost involuntarily, the name a relic of whispered childhood confidences and unspoken promises.
The boy she had run from, leaving behind the country and everything it meant, had grown into the man who now regarded her with an expression that was impossible to read. His eyes held recognition, yes, but also something sharper, a shadow of old resentment. Henry's horse slowed as he approached the edge of the garden, and Clara felt an unexpected tightness in her chest. She had rehearsed countless words, apologies, and explanations during the journey, yet now, confronted by his presence, all that preparation evaporated. "You have returned," he said finally, his voice calm, but edged with something unspoken, something that cut deeper than any accusation. "Yes," Clara replied, her tone steady despite the flutter in her stomach. I came back to handle the family estate. It is a matter of duty." I paused, choosing her next words with care. "I never intended to return, but circumstance leaves little choice." Henry's eyes narrowed slightly, though he did not speak. He dismounted with practiced grace, the horse's hooves silent on the soft ground. When he finally stood before her, the air seemed to thicken. The years apart, the distance, and the silence they had both endured created a tension so palpable it might have been cut with a knife. "You have left abruptly," he said. At last, a statement, not a question. "Do you expect me to greet your return with ease?" Clara's throat tightened. She wanted to tell him everything, about her fears, her ambitions, the reasons she had fled London and avoided this very place. But she could not yet. Her pride, mingled with a lingering fear of his anger, compelled her to remain measured. "I cannot undo the past," she said softly, letting her gray eyes meet his. "But I can face it. That is why I have returned." A silence fell between them, broken only by the faint rustle of leaves in the morning wind. Clara could sense the war within him, the residual hurt, the stubbornness of memory, and perhaps, buried beneath it all, a flicker of hope she dared not acknowledge. Henry finally nodded, almost imperceptibly, though his gaze never wavered. "Then you shall find the estate much changed, and perhaps you too will find that time has its own way of altering hearts." Clara's lips curved slightly, a hint of something almost like a smile. "Time has altered much, Mr. Calder. Perhaps it will teach us both some forgiveness." He said nothing further, but his posture softened imperceptibly. Yet the unspoken tension remained, a delicate thread connecting them, reminding Clara that the land was not the only thing with roots too deep to ignore.
Clara walked slowly across the expanse of the Montague estate, her gloved hands brushing lightly against the wildflowers that had claimed the neglected edges of the garden. Each step stirred the memories of summers long past, the laughter of her siblings, the warmth of sun on her face, and the quiet companionship of one boy who had once understood her in ways no one else could. Henry Calder rode beside her now, guiding his horse along the narrow path that wound between fields and hedgerows. The morning mist clung to his coat, softening the sharp angles of his features, though it did nothing to conceal the storm of emotions she saw reflected in his dark eyes. He was still as observant, still as measured, yet beneath the calm exterior, Clara sensed the lingering bitterness of years lost. "You've let the fields go," he said quietly, gesturing toward the overgrown pastures and the fences that sagged under the weight of neglect. "This land deserves better than it has received." Her heart ached at his words. "I know," she admitted,
her voice barely above a whisper. "I was gone, and it was beyond my control. I can only hope to restore what I can in the time that remains." Henry's gaze softened slightly, though his expression remained guarded. "Time alone cannot heal everything, Clara. Some wounds are left by more than neglect. Some are left by abandonment." She felt a pang of guilt at his pointed reminder, the memory of her hurried departure, the tears in his eyes as she boarded the carriage for London searing itself into her memory. "I never meant to hurt you," she said, her voice trembling just slightly. "I was young, frightened. I thought I had no choice." His horse shifted beneath him, a subtle sign of agitation. "And yet you returned only when duty forced your hand. Did the land call you, or did something else?" She met his gaze, unflinching despite the unease that fluttered in her chest. "The land, yes, but also the truth of what was left unresolved. Some stories cannot end without facing the past." For a long moment, Henry said nothing. The morning was still, save for the soft hum of insects and the occasional bird taking wing. Then, slowly, he nodded. "Very well. Then perhaps we shall see if the past can be made to live again, not as it was, but as it ought to be." They rode together in silence for several minutes, the rhythm of horse hooves a gentle cadence that echoed the quiet pulse of their hearts. Clara felt the tension between them ease slightly, though the weight of unspoken words and memories remained. As they reached the old orchard, she paused. The trees were gnarled and heavy with fruit, their branches drooping toward the earth, burdened by years of neglect. Clara dismounted, her boots sinking slightly into the soft soil. "This orchard," she murmured, touching the rough bark of a tree, "was my favorite place as a child. I used to hide here, read my books, and dream of London." Henry dismounted as well, standing a short distance away, his arms crossed. "And yet you left it all behind," he said quietly, the edge of sorrow and reproach lingering in his tone. Clara took a deep breath, the autumnal scent of apples and earth filling her senses. "I thought I was leaving behind only a place. I did not realize I was leaving behind someone, too." Henry's eyes flickered, the briefish shadow of a smile passing over his lips. "It seems the land has a way of reminding us of what we cannot forget." Clara nodded, her gaze tracing the horizon where the Montague fields met Calder's adjoining pastures. "And perhaps it insists that some things be replanted, nurtured, before they can flourish again." For the first time that morning they allowed themselves a shared silence, standing amidst the trees, the past and present entwined, each waiting to see if the other would take the first step toward reconciliation. Clara returned to the farmhouse, the familiar creak of the wooden floors greeting her like an old friend. Dust motes danced in the afternoon light, and the scent of aged wood mingled with the faint sweetness of wildflowers that had grown unchecked. It was comforting and sorrowful all at once. Henry remained outside, overseeing the boundaries of the property, his expression unreadable as he watched her from a distance. "I assume you intend to sell," he said without preamble, his voice carrying across the veranda. Clara met his gaze steadily. "I do. The family's debts are pressing, and this land, it must find new caretakers. I cannot remain." His brow furrowed, and a shadow passed across his face. "Yet you return, knowing full well the complications it may cause, not just for yourself, but for those of us who still reside here, tending what remains of our family's legacies." She nodded. biting back a sigh. "I would not have returned if I did not feel compelled to make this right. I owe the land, and perhaps I owe you, an explanation that words alone cannot provide." Henry's jaw tightened, and he turned to walk along the fence line, gesturing vaguely with one hand. "Explanations cannot undo years of absence, Clara. You left as if the life here meant nothing to you, and I was left with nothing but questions and bitterness." Clara followed, keeping pace with him despite the chill in the air. "I was afraid, Henry," she admitted softly, "afraid of my own limitations, afraid of the world beyond this estate. I believed leaving was the only way to survive, but I could never have imagined the weight it would leave behind." He paused at the edge of the orchard, his gaze fixed on the overgrown rows of apple trees. "Do you think it is enough, returning now, to heal what was broken?" Clara stepped closer, the crunch of dry leaves underfoot punctuating her words. "I do not know if it is enough, but I know that leaving it as it is would be far worse. The land, it deserves care, and so do we, though I fear that may be far more difficult." Henry finally turned, his eyes meeting hers with a mixture of frustration and something softer, something that mirrored the quiet ache she felt in her own chest. "And if the land is sold," he asked, his voice low, "will that end whatever tension remains between us?" Clara shook her head. "No, the land is only a part of our story. Some roots run deeper than soil, Henry. They cannot be severed so easily." He studied her, the silence stretching between them like a taut wire. The air was heavy with unspoken words, and yet beneath the tension Clara sensed the faintest flicker of hope, an acknowledgement that perhaps the past need not dictate the future entirely. Finally he spoke, his voice quieter now, almost reluctant. "Then perhaps we ought to see what remains can be salvaged before decisions are made." Clara allowed herself a small, cautious smile. "I was hoping you might say that." They walked back to the farmhouse together, the afternoon sun casting long shadows over the fields, and for the first time in years the land seemed to hum with possibility, not just for its future, but for theirs as well.
The next morning, Clara rose early, the soft light of dawn spilling across the worn wooden floors of the farmhouse. She had decided that if she was to sell the estate, she needed a thorough understanding of its boundaries, its crops, and the work that had kept generations of her family alive. Henry was already outside, standing in the dew-laden grass, surveying the rows of neglected fields. When he saw her step onto the porch, he tipped his hat slightly. "I hope you are prepared," he said, a trace of amusement in his otherwise solemn tone. "The work ahead is more than paperwork and signatures. It is soil, sweat, and stubborn roots." Clara met his gaze steadily. "I am aware. I will not shy away from it." He studied her, his expression unreadable. "Nor should you. But you must also understand, the land remembers those who abandon it." She followed him across the fields, the early morning mist curling around their ankles. The orchard was in worse condition than she had imagined. Some trees bent under the weight of their own neglect, while others weeds strangled, claiming what had once been carefully nurtured. "I left in haste," Clara said quietly, breaking the silence that had stretched between them. "I did not intend to abandon the land, nor you. I believed I had no choice." Henry's jaw tightened. "And yet the land suffered, and I suffered.
Do you know what it is to tend a field alone, hoping for the care that will not come?" Clara's throat tightened. "I do not pretend to understand fully, but I am here now, and I will do what I can." The two worked side by side, their hands occasionally brushing over the stubborn soil. Each touch was a reminder of the years lost, of promises unspoken, of young hearts torn apart by circumstance. Clara noticed how Henry moved with quiet authority, the ease of someone who had spent a lifetime with the land, someone who knew each furrow, each tree as if it were an extension of himself. As the sun climbed higher, the day became a rhythm of labor and tentative conversation. Clara discovered the old irrigation channels had collapsed. Henry showed her how to clear them without harming the roots. She noticed the faintest smile tug at his lips when she grasped the technique, and she felt her own heart lift at the small victory. By midday, their hands were raw, their clothes streaked with soil, yet the fields already looked tamer, more alive. Henry paused, wiping his brow with a handkerchief. "I am surprisingly capable," he admitted, though his tone carried an unspoken challenge. Clara allowed herself a small, wry smile. "Perhaps you underestimate the widow of modest means. I have had plenty of experience surviving." Henry's eyes lingered on her, a flicker of something softer, a memory of the girl he had once adored, now grown into a woman of strength and resolve. Yet the shadow of the past remained between them, unspoken but heavy. As they returned to the farmhouse for a brief midday rest, Clara realized that the work ahead would not only demand their strength and skill, but also the courage to confront the wounds of the past. And she knew, deep down, that the land, like their hearts, would not yield to neglect forever.
As the sun dipped toward the horizon, casting the fields in a golden glow, Clara found herself seated on the porch, hands still tinged with soil, heart unusually restless. Henry had returned to check the barn and livestock, leaving her a rare moment of quiet. The breeze carried the scent of earth and the faint sweetness of blooming clover. Clara inhaled deeply, trying to steady the tumult within her. She had returned to the land she thought she had abandoned forever, only to discover that some roots, like memories, never truly left. Henry emerged from the barn, wiping his hands on a coarse linen towel. He approached slowly, the weight of unsaid words visible in the set of his shoulders. "You handled the fields well today," he said, his tone more measured than usual. "Perhaps more than I expected." Clara looked up, meeting his gaze. "I am learning, slowly, but I intend to understand." He took a step closer, his eyes flicking briefly to the orchard, then back to her. "And what of your understanding of me?" he asked, softly, the question carrying more than curiosity. It carried a quiet challenge. Clara's chest tightened, and for a moment she seemed on the verge of saying something sharp. Instead, he exhaled slowly, the tension in his broad frame easing slightly. "It is difficult to forgive absence, Clara. You cannot imagine the nights I spent wondering why you left, why I was left behind in silence." "I do not ask for forgiveness," she said quietly. "I only ask for the chance to prove that the care I once withheld was never from you, but from fear of losing myself entirely." He studied her, eyes dark and searching. "Fear. Yes, I can understand that. Perhaps we are both afraid in our own ways." Clara shifted slightly, noticing the faint crease of emotion around his eyes. "And yet," she said,
choosing her words carefully. "Here we are, together again, not as children, not as we were, but as we might yet be." Henry's gaze softened, although the storm of memory still lingered behind it. "Together," he echoed, the word carrying a tentative promise. A long silence stretched between them, broken only by the distant calls of birds returning to their nests. Clara realized that the land around them, with its stubborn roots and hidden streams, was a mirror of their own heart, wounded, resilient, and capable of renewal if tended with patience and courage. Finally, Henry spoke again, voice low but steady. "Tomorrow we must survey the northern fields. There is much to repair, much to protect." Clara rose, brushing her hands on her skirt, and met his gaze squarely. "Then we shall face it together, Henry, one step at a time as the land teaches us." He nodded, and for the first time since their reunion, a hint of a smile touched his lips. It was small, almost imperceptible, but it carried the weight of something precious: hope. As night fell over the estate, the farmhouse glowed with candlelight, the fields dark and quiet beyond. Clara knew that the coming days would test them in ways neither had anticipated. Yet for the first time she allowed herself to imagine that perhaps, just perhaps, some wounds could be healed and some stories could be replanted.
The morning arrived crisp and bright, the Yorkshire air carrying a faint hint of autumn. Clara awoke with a restless energy, eager to inspect the northern fields as Henry had requested. She dressed simply but neatly, her skirts tucked just enough to allow movement without losing grace, and stepped outside into the soft light. Henry was already waiting at the edge of the property, leaning against the fence with a surveying staff in hand. His posture was rigid, almost military, yet there was a flicker of relief when he saw her. "I trust you slept well?" he asked, though the question carried no expectation of a polite answer. "As well as one can, when the day ahead promises both labor and revelation," Clara replied, her lips curving into a small, knowing smile. Henry allowed a brief chuckle before gesturing to the fields. "Then let us see what remains of the northern stretch. If we are to salvage these lands, we must be thorough." The journey across the fields was quiet at first. Clara observed the furrows, the remnants of last season's crops, and the stubborn weeds that had taken hold. Henry's eyes constantly scanned the terrain, noting imperfections and planning repairs. Clara followed his directions carefully, yet when she suggested a small alteration to the irrigation layout, Henry paused. "Are you certain of this?" he asked, eyebrows raised. "I am. The soil will retain moisture more efficiently if we divert the water slightly. It will benefit the young saplings." Henry studied her for a long moment, then nodded, a flash of respect softening his features. "Very well. Let us see if your theory holds." As they worked, the physical proximity, the brushing of hands and the shared concentration began to bridge the chasm of years. Yet with every small victory, Clara felt the weight of old guilt pressing against her chest. She had left him once, abandoned the land, and in a sense the heart she had cherished. Could she ever undo the hurt of that choice? Henry, too, battled his own storm. The sight of her, grown, strong, competent, rekindled memories of their shared childhood, of whispered promises beneath the willow, of hands clasped in secret. And yet the bitterness of her sudden departure lingered, a stubborn root that refused to loosen. By midday they paused to rest under the shade of a solitary oak. Clara leaned against the trunk, brushing a strand of copper hair from her face, and allowed herself a moment to breathe. "Henry, do you ever wonder if our paths were meant to diverge?" she asked softly.
Henry's jaw tightened, but his eyes betrayed the conflict within. "I have wondered every day since you left. And yet, seeing you here now, I cannot help but feel the pull of what might have been, and what still might be." Clara's heart fluttered at his words, a mixture of hope and fear entwined in their meaning. She realized that the land, with its patient endurance and hidden resilience, mirrored the possibilities of their own hearts. Henry's gaze softened, and for a brief instant the walls they had both erected seemed to crumble. "We have much work ahead," he said, tone careful yet intimate. "Not just with the land, but with ourselves. Can we face that?" Clara straightened, meeting his eyes with determination. "We will face it," she said firmly, "together." And as they returned to the northern fields, hands occasionally brushing, hearts quietly stirring, both understood that the seeds of reconciliation and perhaps of love had been planted. But whether they would grow or wither remained a question neither could yet answer. The following days unfolded in a rhythm both familiar and strange. Clara rose early each morning, her skirts brushing the dew-soaked grass as she joined Henry in the fields. Together they worked to mend the broken fences, clear the irrigation ditches, and tend the neglected orchard. Each task demanded their strength, yet it also wove them into a quiet partnership, their movements growing instinctively in harmony. But harmony was fragile. One afternoon, as Clara knelt to pull weeds from the base of a young apple tree, Henry stood nearby, repairing a section of the fence. The sound of hammer striking nail echoed in the air, steady and firm. "You handled the land with more patience than I expected. It is almost as though you had never left." Clara froze, her fingers tightening on the stubborn weed. "But I did leave, and I know the wound it caused." Henry set down the hammer, his shoulders taut. "You knew how much I cared for you, Clara, and still you departed, without a word, without farewell. Do you think the land was the only thing abandoned?" The accusation cut deep, though his tone was calm. Clara rose slowly, brushing dirt from her hands. Her eyes met his, steady, though her heart raced. "I left because I feared being trapped. The weight of expectation, marriage, children, a life bound to this soil, terrified me then. I thought leaving was the only way to breathe." Henry's jaw tightened. "And now? Do you still feel suffocated here?" Clara hesitated. Her gaze drifted across the orchard, where the branches swayed gently in the wind. "Now, I see the land differently. It does not feel like a chain, but a chance to root myself, if only I can summon the courage." For a long moment, Henry studied her, the storm in his eyes softening. "Courage," he murmured. "That is what it has always required." The silence between them shifted, heavy yet charged with something unspoken. Clara felt the pull of years collapsing, the girl who once fled and the woman who now stood, steady and determined. She wanted to reach for him, to bridge the gap with touch, yet fear held her still. Henry broke the silence, his voice quieter, almost hesitant. "Clara, there were nights I dreamed you would return, and mornings I cursed myself for still hoping." Her breath caught. "And now that I had returned?" His gaze lingered on her, dark and searching. "Now, I do not know whether to thank fate or curse it again." The words hung in the air, raw and unresolved. Clara's heart ached with both guilt and longing. She wanted to speak, to ease the bitterness that still clung to him, but the moment was interrupted by the distant toll of the church bell from the village beyond the hills. Henry turned sharply, as though the sound had broken a spell. "We should finish here," he said curtly, lifting the hammer again. Clara swallowed her reply, kneeling once more to the earth. Yet as she worked, her mind churned with the knowledge that Henry's heart still bore the scars of her departure, and she wondered if love, like the land, could ever truly recover from neglect, or if some wounds ran too deep to heal.
The late afternoon sun dipped lower, bathing the fields in a warm amber light. Clara and Henry had spent hours laboring side by side, their silence no longer heavy, but tinged with something unspoken. When the day's work finally ended, Henry suggested they walk toward the old willow tree that stood near the stream, a place once sacred to their youth. The willow loomed tall and familiar, its branches trailing into the gentle water. Clara paused beneath its shade, her breath catching at the rush of memories, stolen laughter, whispered promises, and the kiss they had once shared as children barely grown. Henry leaned against the trunk, his expression softened by the golden glow. "It has not changed," he said quietly. "Not the tree, not the stream. Only we have." Clara touched the bark, her fingers tracing the initials they had carved so many years ago, still visible, though weathered by time. A lump rose in her throat. "We thought the world was simple then, that love would be enough." Henry's gaze lingered on her face, steady and unflinching. "Was it not?" Her breath hitched. "I was young, frightened. I wanted more than the confines of the land, more than the life expected of me. But what I failed to see was that you were never the chain. I was." His eyes darkened, the hurt mingling with a tenderness he seemed reluctant to reveal. Slowly, almost hesitantly, he stepped closer. The space between them narrowed, and Clara felt her pulse quicken. His hand brushed against hers, rough from years of labor, and the contact sent a shiver up her arm. "Clara," he murmured, her name heavy with longing and restraint. "Do you know how many times I imagined this moment, that you would return, that I could stand here again with you?" Her heart pounded. "And do you regret imagining it?" Henry's lips curved into the faintest, bitter-sweet smile. "I regret nothing, save that it never came sooner." The air seemed to still around them. He leaned closer, the scent of earth and wood lingering on him, his breath mingling with hers. Clara's eyes fluttered shut, anticipation coiling within her chest, the years of distance collapsing in an instant. But before their lips could meet, the sound of hurried footsteps broke the spell. "Mr. Whitmore! Miss Hawthorne!" A young farmhand, breathless and flushed, rushed toward them from across the field. "Forgive the intrusion, but there's been trouble with the cattle. The northern gate's been breached." Henry drew back at once, his jaw tightening, the moment shattered. Clara's breath trembled as she opened her eyes, finding his expression guarded once more. Duty reclaimed him swiftly. "See to it at once, Henry," ordered the boy, then turned to Clara, his voice clipped, though his eyes betrayed the remnants of what had almost been. "We will continue this another time." Clara nodded faintly, though her heart ached with the interruption. Beneath the willow, the echo of what might have happened lingered in the air, fragile and unresolved. As they walked back toward the fields, side by side but not touching, Clara realized that fate, or perhaps the land itself, was determined to test their patience before allowing their hearts to fully entwine again. The commotion at the northern fields stretched late into the evening. Henry worked with the farmhands to drive the cattle back into their pen, his command sharp and efficient. Clara, though less accustomed to such tasks, refused to remain idle. She held lanterns, fetched tools, and even calmed a frightened calf with a steady hand. By the time the last gate was secured, darkness had fully descended, and the air was thick with the scent of trampled grass and sweat. Henry stood at the edge of the pasture, chest rising heavily, his silhouette stark against the lantern light. "You should not have strained yourself," he said when Clara approached, his tone clipped but tinged with concern. "I will not be a bystander on my own land," she answered firmly.
If I am to decide its fate, I must know what it demands." Henry's eyes flicked toward her, catching the determination etched across her face. "Spoken like someone who intends to stay," he murmured. Clara's breath caught at the implication. I have not decided. The debts weigh heavily. Selling may still be the only answer." His jaw clenched and his voice hardened. "Then you would rid yourself of this place, after all it's given your family, after all it still offers?" Her temper flared. "Do not speak as though I am a stranger to sacrifice, Henry. I have lived with the cost of my choices every day since I left." The words struck like flint against steel, sparking tension that hung between them. For a moment, Henry said nothing, only stared across the pasture where the cattle settled uneasily. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter, though no less intense. "I built my life upon these fields. Every fence mended, every crop harvested, I did it with the knowledge that you were gone. And now you return, speaking of debts and sales, as though the land is a ledger to be balanced, rather than a legacy to be kept." Her throat tightened. "And yet, despite your bitterness, you have not turned me away. Why?" Henry met her gaze, his eyes shadowed yet fierce. "Because part of me still believes this land is not lost, and part of me—" He stopped abruptly, jaw tightening. "Part of me cannot let go of what once was." The silence that followed was heavy, filled with all that remained unsaid. Clara longed to reach for him, to remind him that her heart, though faltering, had never ceased to carry his memory. But before she could, one of the farm hands called out, breaking the moment. Henry turned sharply, his composure snapping back into place. "We should return. There is still much to do come morning." Clara followed, her skirts brushing the damp grass, her heart aching with the knowledge that the boundary between them, like the fences they had just mended, remained strong, even as cracks began to form.
The evening was alive with the hum of conversation, the soft laughter of ladies, and the deep murmur of gentlemen. The ballroom at Ashcombe Manor glowed with the brilliance of candlelight reflected upon gilded mirrors, while the strains of violins filled the air. Clara, adorned in a gown of pale ivory with delicate lace at the sleeves, felt as though every step she took echoed the weight of her past and the uncertainty of her future. She had not expected to see him here, though some part of her had secretly wished for it. Yet when she caught sight of Henry across the hall, tall, broad-shouldered, his gaze fixed upon her with that same piercing intensity, her heart betrayed her by quickening. "Lady Ashcombe," a voice called, dragging her momentarily from her thoughts. So Edmund Harrington bowed politely, his smile easy, his manner perfectly practiced. "Might I have the honor of this dance?" Clara hesitated only a moment before accepting, if only to steady herself. As the music swelled, so Edmund guided her across the floor with precision. Yet Clara's attention betrayed her. Each turn, each graceful motion seemed haunted by the weight of Henry's gaze. She could feel it, like an unspoken tether binding them even when oceans, or ballrooms, stood between. As the dance drew to its end, so Edmund leaned closer, his tone dipped in casual charm. "It must be fate that brought you back, my lady. Some things are not so easily left behind." His words, though meant in jest, struck too deeply. She forced a smile, her heart restless. Before she could respond, Henry approached, bowing stiffly. "Sir Edmund, my lady." His voice carried a restrained formality, yet his eyes held storms. "Mr. Whitcomb," Edmund replied, with the faintest hint of rivalry. Clara's breath caught as Henry extended his hand, the gesture a silent demand. "The next set is beginning. May I?" Caught between the steady propriety of Edmund and the unresolved ache of Henry, Clara hesitated.
but her hand, as if moved by something older than reason, found Henry's. The contact was electric, an echo of childhood summers, of laughter among the fields, of promises never spoken, yet always understood. As the music carried them into the dance, their movements spoke where words could not. Henry's touch was firm, his nearness overwhelming. "You should not have come back," he murmured under the veil of the violins. "And yet," Clara whispered, eyes locked with his, "here I am." The dance continued, a battle of shadows and light, and though the room brimmed with society's watchful eyes, in that moment it felt as though they were alone, two hearts circling the same wound, daring to reopen what had never truly healed. The dance ended, yet the current between them did not fade. Henry released Clara's hand only when propriety demanded it, but his eyes lingered, filled with words unspoken. She curtsied with practiced grace, though her breath trembled. The applause of the ballroom faded into background noise, for her pulse thundered louder than the violins. As Clara turned to retreat toward the safety of her aunt's company, Henry's voice found her again, low and unyielding. "Walk with me." It was not a request, and though her pride bristled, her heart obeyed. They slipped from the golden light of the ballroom into the cool night air of the manor gardens. The scent of roses and damp earth embraced them, while the stars, distant and silent, bore witness. The quiet was thick, broken only by the crunch of gravel beneath their steps, until Henry stopped abruptly. "Why did you return, Clara?" His voice was rough, sharp with restrained bitterness. Was it not enough to leave once, to vanish without a word, as though what we had meant nothing? She flinched, his accusation a blade across her carefully guarded composure. "You think I wish to go?" she replied, her voice faltering. "You think I did not leave behind pieces of myself when I obeyed my father's command?" Henry's jaw tightened, his silhouette rigid against the pale moonlight. He said, each word weighted with years of silence, "You were my world, and you cast me aside for London, its wealth, its titles, its glittering halls. Did you not think I was worth fighting for?" The truth struck her harder than she wished to admit. Shame rose in her, but also indignation. "I was a girl, Henry, powerless against my father's will. Do you believe I would have chosen that exile, to live among strangers, always dreaming of the fields and skies I left behind?" Her voice cracked, and in it lived the sorrow of years. He looked at her then, truly looked, as though searching for the girl he once loved within the woman who stood before him. And for the first time Clara saw the wound beneath his anger. A boy abandoned, a man hardened by betrayal. They stood in silence, the night air trembling with all that remained unsaid. Then, softer, almost breaking, Henry whispered, "Do you regret leaving me?" Her lips parted, but no answer came at once, for regret was too small a word for the ache that had haunted her. She lifted her gaze to his, her eyes shining. Every day. The distance between them seemed to vanish, as though the earth itself urged them closer. But just as the moment threatened to collapse into something undeniable, Clara pulled back, breathless with fear of what surrender might mean. "Henry," she whispered, torn between duty, guilt, and desire. He reached for her hand, his fingers brushing hers like a vow and a question all at once. "Then do not run from me again." The garden held its breath, waiting for her choice. The garden seemed suspended in time, as though the stars themselves leaned closer to listen. Clara's breath caught at Henry's words. "Do not run from me again." The plea and the command twisted together, both fragile and fierce. She wanted to answer, but her voice failed her. All the years apart, all the moments lost, pressed upon her chest like a weight. Her hand remained in his, trembling, yet unwilling to retreat. Henry's thumb brushed her knuckles, rough from labor, and yet unbearably tender. "I cannot pretend indifference any longer," he said, his tone breaking with the honesty he had fought so hard to contain. "You live in every corner of this land, in the trees we climbed, in the fields we ran through. I tried to bury it, Clara, but the roots run too deep." Her eyes filled, the strength of his words cracking her defenses. "And yet," she whispered, "I fear what it would mean to stay. The past lies between us like a shadow. My family's debts, my father's pride, my silence. Henry, what if the land binds us only in sorrow?" For a heartbeat, his face hardened, as though anger might rise again. But instead, he stepped closer, closing the space that had tormented them. "Then let it bind us in something greater. Let us take the sorrow and replant it into something new. Do you not see, Clara? This land does not let go, and neither do I." Her heart thundered as his nearness consumed her. She could feel the warmth of him, the scent of earth and smoke that clung to his coat. And when his hand rose to her cheek, she did not resist. "Henry," her voice was a whisper, trembling between protest and surrender. But before she could speak further, his lips found hers. The kiss was not gentle, it was fierce, desperate, carrying years of longing, of anger, of love unspent. Clara gasped against him, her tears mingling with the press of his mouth, and for one glorious, shattering instant, the world disappeared, leaving only the two of them bound in the truth of what had always been. When they parted, breathless, her forehead rested against his. "I cannot promise the world will forgive us," she murmured. "Let the world do as it pleases," Henry replied, his voice steady as the land beneath them. "We are ours to forgive." The night seemed to exhale, the roses stirring as if in approval. Yet even as they clung to each other, Clara knew the choice ahead would demand more than words and kisses. The land, with its roots and claims, would test them still. But for the first time, she felt ready to face it. Dawn broke over Ashcombe with a quiet majesty, painting the fields in hues of gold and rose. Clara stood upon the porch of the old farmhouse, her gaze sweeping across the land that had once felt like a prison, and now, after so many tears and confessions, looked like home again. Henry approached from the stables, the early light catching in his dark hair, his stride purposeful. He carried himself with the ease of one rooted to the earth, and yet, when his eyes found hers, the steadiness faltered with tenderness. "You are awake early," he said, his voice softened from the storm of the night before. "I could not sleep," Clara confessed. "The land speaks differently now. It does not accuse, it calls." Henry stepped closer, studying her in an intensity that made her heart ache. "And will you answer?" For a moment silence hung between them, heavy with the weight of choice. Clara's gaze drifted to the horizon, where the fields stretched endless and alive. She thought of her father's debts, of London's glittering false promises, of the girl she once had been, powerless, voiceless. But she was no longer that girl. Turning to Henry, she reached for his hand, steady and sure. "I will not sell it. These lands belong to more than the name written in the deeds. They belong to memory, to roots, to the promise of what we might grow together. If you will have me, Her voice faltered, but her eyes did not waver. "I would stay." For the first time in years, Henry's guarded composure broke into a smile, unsteady, disbelieving, but bright with hope. He pulled her close, his arms firm around her, as if to make certain she would not vanish again. "You have always been here, Clara, even when you were gone." Tears burned her eyes, but they were no longer born of sorrow. "And I always shall be." The morning stretched before them, wide and untamed. Together they stepped down from the porch, hand in hand, into the fields that had once separated them and now bound them together. The soil beneath their feet was rich, waiting, ready. Whatever hardships lay ahead, they would face them not as two souls divided by the past, but as one, replanting what had been cut short, and harvesting not only the earth's yield, but the love that endured against time itself. The land had claimed them both, and in its embrace they chose to begin again.
If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel so you won't miss what's coming next. Want to see the continuation of this story? Comment below and let us know what you think. Your opinion makes all the difference.